Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. There are really two reasons behind the Scottish Conservatives asking for this debate this afternoon. Firstly, a 30-minute statement last week, with less than an hour prior to that to digest very significant amount of economic analysis, was not satisfactory in terms of this Chamber's parliamentary scrutiny time. And secondly, this is the first projected longer-term outline of the Scottish Government's fiscal policies since 2011, a timeline that we welcome. So we believe that extended scrutiny is absolutely essential, particularly at a time of very challenging economic circumstances. So let me begin by stating some of the key facts. The Scottish Fiscal Commission's December 2021 statistics show that the overall Scottish Government budget for 22-23 would no longer receive ongoing COVID funding as the pandemic eased. What is also correct, however, and the Cabinet Secretary should know by now, that all the expert statistics, including those from SPICE and the Institute of Fiscal Studies, confirm that the real terms block grant received from Westminster was the largest in the history of devolution and is set to rise in real terms for the lifetime of this Parliament, and the Scottish Government received around £15 billion of additional COVID spend for the previous 2 financial years, and that the Scottish Government has had £7 billion more to spend than it expected 4 years ago. And here are some more facts. Income tax revenues are growing more slowly than the income tax block grant adjustment. The Institute of Fiscal Studies predicted income tax revenues will be around £428 million less than it would have been the case if the income tax had remained within a UK tax structure. From 2024 to 25, the UK income tax rate will reduce to 19%. But as yet there are no signs of the Scottish Government making the same commitment, and I'll come back to that later. The social security spend is set to rise from 10% to 14% within the resource budget. The size of Scotland's labour force is falling, as is the labour market participation rate. And then there is the huge black hole in the public finances, which yet again, this time at the Finance Committee, the Finance Secretary told us doesn't exist. And on top of these facts is the backdrop to the current economic situation. As Dame Susan Rice spelt out last week, the war in Ukraine, the significant increase in global energy prices and difficulties in international supply chains, most especially those related to China, are creating serious challenges to every single economy across the world. So it is perfectly true that there is greater uncertainty within the economy than was the case in December 2021 when forecasts were published. Likewise, what is also correct, and I repeat my views from several previous debates in this chamber, is the fact that there are aspects of the current fiscal framework which exacerbate uncertainty, because it does not help that there is very considerable time lags between, and often sometimes a divergence between, the forecasts of the SFC and the OBR. And it doesn't help that the framework is not inflation adjusted, two aspects which I hope will be resolved when the current negotiations of the new fiscal framework are concluded. But neither can the Cabinet Secretary blame the fiscal framework on Westminster, because it was her predecessor John Swinney, as well as UK Government ministers, who signed up to it in 2016. The long and short, Deputy Presiding Officer, confirmed by all the economic forecasters, is that the Scottish Government is spending too much in comparison to what it is raising. And if the Cabinet Secretary doesn't like the term black hole, let me try the term shortfall. And let me remind her of what David Phillips of the Institute of Fiscal Studies said last week, and I quote, "A series of expensive spending commitments on top of the underlying spending pressures mean that the Scottish Government faces a multi-billion shortfall over the next 4 years. A multi-billion shortfall over the next 4 years." Now, we know that as a result of all this, the Cabinet Secretary has decided to make savage cuts to public sector jobs. The New Statesman, I think it was, offered the view that this includes many jobs in government agencies, such as Quangos, Transport Scotland, Marine Scotland, Food Standards and SEPA are all mentioned in this article, so we'll see what happens here. But I'm sure that the public will find it very difficult indeed to understand why on earth such substantial real-term cuts are to be made to the following: to our police, who are on the front line of keeping our communities safe, to local government services, to trade and enterprise, to tourism, and to our universities, which the Cabinet Secretary admitted yesterday are integral to the realisation of the National Economic Transformation Strategy and which play such a vital role when it comes to developing research and development and innovation. And this is exactly the same public who will see the profligacy of the SNP government wasting vast sums of public money on ferries that don't sail, BIFAB, Prestwick Airport, the Militias Rangers prosecution, the list goes on. And of course there is the 20 million preparing for a second referendum. Yes, I will take an intervention.
Stuart McMillan.
Thank you very much, and thanks to Liz Smith for taking intervention. Yet again, we've got the Conservative Party in this chamber talking about the ferries being a waste of money. Is Liz Smith certainly in this chamber? Is Liz Smith saying to the population of Inverclyde, is Liz Smith saying to the workforce of Ferguson's that they are a waste of money?
Liz Smith.
I can't believe that question, actually. It is absolutely patently obvious about the extent of the waste of public money that is being afforded by this SNP government. And that is totalling up almost week by week. And therefore taking away an awful lot of the money that could have been used, should have been used, in order to finance the public books. Now, can I just remind the Chamber what Audit Scotland has been saying about parliamentary scrutiny over public money, and this perhaps might go to answering another part of that question that I've just been asked. The Scottish Government, again I quote, the Scottish Government needs to be much more proactive in showing where and how money is spent and showing a clearer line from budgets to funding announcements to actual spending. This will support scrutiny and transparency, and that, Cabinet Secretary, is exactly the same conclusion as the Finance Committee came to in this Parliament. So let me turn to the tax issue, which is central to the problems currently facing the Scottish Government, both in terms of the disincentives and in terms of the weaknesses of the tax take. The Cabinet Secretary has been saying that Scotland has a very progressive income tax policy, but she should heed the warnings of the Scottish Fiscal Commission, who state that within the next 5 years, Kate Forbes will have 700,000 middle earners in a higher tax bracket. Neither should the Cabinet Secretary forget that in December, the Scottish Fiscal Commission dismissed her claims that the majority of Scots would be paying less tax. That is simply not borne out by the evidence. And of course, the disincentives which come from this are likely to be significant, and most importantly, Scotland's divergence from the UK income tax rate threatens to damage Scotland's competitiveness, which is why we want to see a return to parity as soon as resources allow. Yes, I would.
John Mason.
Would the member accept that through the different tax policies we have raised £240 million extra for 2018-19, which are the latest figures, and if we didn't have that money there would be further cuts to police or anything else?
Well, Smith?
Mr Mason sits on the same committee that I do that has been scrutinising the finances, and he will know exactly what some of the projections are about the downturn in the tax take in terms of the revenues that we are suffering from, and that's exactly the problem that I'm referring to in this, because the tax revenue situation is actually the most worrying of all, since not only does it reflect the very serious challenges about the primary source of government spending, but also serious imbalances in the Scottish economy, and these imbalances, most especially those which relate to the labour force, mean that it is highly likely that we will continue to lag behind the UK when it comes to several key economic indicators, because higher tax rates are not delivering the higher tax revenues that we need, and that is obviously a very serious concern. Yes, of course.
Cabinet Secretary Kate Forbes.
She's just made a comment that's contradicted by David Phillips from the IFS, who says explicitly, and I quote, "The tax rises almost certainly have raised revenue." Who's right, her or David Smith?
Of course the tax revenues are up in that sense. Of course they are. But, Cabinet Secretary, they are not up to the extent that, as a Scottish Government requires for the spending. There is a huge divergence. Just this morning at the Scottish Fiscal Commission breakfast, on the graph, that was very patently obvious, and that is a very serious concern. And I think that the context of this is also set out by the Scottish Government's approach to the North East and the oil and gas sectors, sectors which encompass a large number of well-paid, highly skilled workers whose tax contributions to the Scottish economy are extremely important, and that's become a problem because we know only too well that the SNP wants to rip the heart out of these industries. And these issues about tax revenues were set out in very stark terms by the Parliament's Finance Committee, and I remind the Cabinet Secretary of its unanimous conclusions in this, and I quote, The committee believes that such is the outlook for Scotland's economic performance and the downward pressure on the Scottish budget requires greater emphasis on prevention and reform, and it wanted the Scottish Government to streamline and make much more coherent its policy strategies. And in paragraph 97, and again I quote, "We consider the evidence showing Scotland is lagging behind almost all other areas of UK in key economic indicators of economic performance. That is deeply worrying." Presiding Officer, I've mentioned two changes that we'd like to see delivered by the Scottish Government to return to parity when it comes to income tax rates, so that Scotland is not disadvantaged, and a finance bill which would enhance the scrutiny of public spending decisions. But the crucial element in all of this are policies to enhance economic growth, even if the SNP's partners, the Greens, don't agree with that. Scottish Future was absolutely blunt in its analysis last week and described this as the elephant in the room, because it says, and I quote, "is Scotland's long-term failure to increase its growth rates relative to the UK." Scottish Future tells the Scottish Government to stop throwing good money after bad on non-productive projects, and it cites the illogical decision to cut spending on university research as one example. And we agree with that, just as we do about ensuring that there is a much simpler and more easily understood pathway through the enterprise bodies and the grants that they can award. Because just about everybody in business wants that change as quickly as possible, because they are keen to get on with boosting innovation and productivity without the red tape, without the form filling and the complex planning and procurement processes getting in their way. Business feeling good about itself and its future is absolutely essential if Scotland is to achieve the growth rates that we need. In recent weeks, we have had several key business leaders saying that the National Economic Transformation Strategy and the National Investment Bank don't have anything like the clarity and the rigour that we need to deliver growth. But business also wants to see Scotland's governments working together, not embroiled in constant bickering and constitutional wrangles, which divert attention away from the important focus. Another unanimous conclusion of the Finance Committee. Presiding Officer, Scotland has immense talent in every corner of the country. We need to mobilise that talent in every way we can. We need policies that support talent, which incentivise investment, which support our businesses, our public services, and a Scottish Government that is wholly committed to efficiency and transparency within the public finances, and not a government that is constantly peddling grudge and grievance at every turn and not looking after our finances properly. And with that, Deputy Presiding Officer, I move the motion in my name.
Thank you. And before calling the next speaker, I would remind all members who wish to speak in the debate to ensure that they have pressed the request to speak buttons. I now call on Kate Forbes, Cabinet Secretary. Up to 9 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. What this debate is really about is why and how Scotland cannot afford to remain under UK Tory rule. It is more than a little ironic that the Conservatives have initiated today's debate on the economy when their Westminster leaders are presiding over the sharpest fall in living standards and the fastest rise in inflation for a generation. They are the very symbol right now across the world of economic mismanagement. Because the true cost of Tory economic mismanagement is laid bare by external commentators. Research by the LSE's Centre for Economic Performance revealed that Tory Brexit has caused food prices to rise by 6%, deepening the cost of living crisis for households across the UK. And just today, the OECD has warned that next year the UK will have the worst economic growth of any G20 country bar Russia. The worst economic growth of any G20 country bar Russia. Yes.
Ms Smith.
I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary giving way. Can I ask her what she felt about the Finance Committee's conclusion? And I quote, "We consider the evidence showing Scotland is lagging behind almost all other areas of UK in economic indicators of key performance areas is deeply worrying." Does she agree?
Cabinet Secretary.
Which government is responsible for faster GDP growth in Scotland in March compared with a fall in GDP across the rest of the UK? And I'll come on to another number of other metrics. But all of that, which I have just detailed, is happening under the leadership of the very party who have brought today's motion. And as I set out in the Chamber last week, although inflation is quite clearly also impacting other countries, it is not impacting them equally. The UK currently has the highest inflation rate of any G7 country and almost twice the rate of France under this Tory government. Under the current devolution settlement, only the UK government has the macroeconomic levers to fully address the cost of living crisis, and they have spectacularly failed to manage our economy in a way that works for businesses and works for households. Poverty is rising, costs are rising, the energy price cap is rising, living standards are falling, growth rates are dropping and competitiveness is sliding under the Conservatives.
Daniel Johnson.
I agree with much of what the Cabinet Secretary says. The Conservatives are doing an absolutely appalling job at running the economy, but isn't that making the case of why we should be doing better? Because while we may not have all the levers she wants, we do have levers, which does not explain why wage growth is underperforming in Scotland compared to the UK average. Can she explain that?
I will. I will come on to that. But I think the context here is important. I recently wrote to the Chancellor with a comprehensive funding package that fully addresses the unprecedented rise in the cost of living. Rather than following this approach and using the fiscal headroom that was available to him to support people and businesses now, the piecemeal package that he announced makes it highly likely that more support will be needed later when energy prices rise significantly in the autumn. In other words, whilst people sit in cold houses right now and turn to food banks, the Chancellor is sitting on a substantial election war chest. And in contrast, and this comes to Daniel Johnson's point, we are doing all that we can in response, and our amendment to today's motion reflects the priorities that we have for Scotland's economy and for our public finances. Our prudent stewardship of our finances and our careful, ambitious management of the economy has resulted in the 2021 EY Attractiveness Survey finding that Scotland has been the top UK destination for foreign direct investment outside London for the past 7 years. Scotland's GDP growing 0.3% in March 2022 compared to a fall of 0.1% in the UK as a whole. Estimates for January showing Scotland's unemployment rate fell to 3.2% in the first quarter of this year, a joint record low and below the UK rate of 3.7%. And Scotland has a positive trade balance in goods, exporting £1 billion more goods than it imported in 2021. Yeah.
Willie Rennie.
So the Cabinet Secretary is willing to take credit for those selective statistics. Is she prepared to accept responsibility for Scotland's overall economic performance, which does lag behind the rest of the United Kingdom? Does she accept any responsibility for that?
Cabinet Secretary.
I mean, the irony of that question is that, yes, we have set out our approach to economic growth over the next 10 years, recognising the work that needs to be done in terms of productivity, in terms of new markets, in terms of entrepreneurship. But there is no way around the fact that the macroeconomic levers sit with the UK government. And if the Liberal Democrats want that to be any different, then I suggest they join us in calling for those, because we have done that with one hand tied behind our back. This year alone, whatever the Conservatives say, I tend to believe independent commentators. This year alone, Scotland's budget is being reduced in real terms by 5.2%. And if we look, I've taken quite a few interventions and I'm probably running low on time. If we look across the whole 4-year period of the resource spending review, our real terms funding is to grow by only 2% after accounting for the devolution of social security benefits. The current fiscal settlement denies us even the most modest of borrowing powers that most governments across the world would have access to, powers that Scotland would have as an independent state. So if we need another reason why Scotland cannot afford to remain under UK Tory rule, researchers at the Glasgow Centre for Population Health found that, and I quote, "Austerity is highly likely to be the most substantial causal contributor to the stalled mortality rates seen in Scotland and across the UK. The Scottish people deserve better than that. And they also deserve informed and intelligent debates on the true nature of our financial outlook. So it's disappointing to see that the Conservatives have once again claimed that, and I quote, "Scotland has imposed higher tax rates on Scotland without increasing revenues." That is factually inaccurate. It is contradicted. It is contradicted by the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who stated last week, and I quote, "We are not saying that tax rises have reduced revenue. The tax rises have almost certainly raised revenue." In the SFC's December 2021 forecast publication, which I think Liz Smith has already referred to, the SFC noted that the Scottish Government's decisions on income tax since 2017 to 18 will add around £552 million to the Scottish budget in 2022-23. In the last 6 months, we have set out our annual budget, a strategy for economic transformation, 2 medium-term financial strategies and a 3-year resource spending review. All of that with the backdrop of a pandemic and the biggest economic shock in over 100 years, the most significant cost of living crisis in a generation, and the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is a humanitarian crisis that is affecting the global economy. There could be no accusation that this government is shying away from its responsibilities on managing our public finances and Scotland's economy and managing them well. It's despite those funding pressures, and it is despite the macroeconomic powers remaining with the UK Government that our resource spending review prioritises our limited resources on the Scottish Government's long-term ambitions for Scotland. Now, other parties in this chamber may have different priorities, but I strongly believe that the priorities that we have set out as part of this resource spending review are the priorities for the people of Scotland. Priorities of tackling child poverty, the priority of transitioning to net zero, the priority of economic recovery and the priority of helping households with the cost of living crisis. It is our job as a mature, fiscally responsible government to deliver those priorities, but Parliament needs to face up to the realities of where powers lie and the realities of a budget that gets cut by the UK Government.